is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. How do adolescents learn to make healthy choices? What motivates the preteen brain? The answers to those questions are evolving as neuroscientists learn more about what drives human behavior, and that could mean some positive developments in both education and mental health. Here to help us break down what all of this means is Lydia Denworth. She is a science writer and contributing editor at Scientific American. She is also an EWA Reporting Fellow. Lydia, welcome to EWA Radio.
Hi, Emily. Good to be here.
We're delighted to have you with us. So even before the COVID-19 pandemic, there was growing concern about the emotional health and wellness of adolescents. Let's start with a definition. What age group are we talking about here?
Well, adolescence, according to neuroscientists, is really a much longer span than we usually think. It goes all the way from about the age of 10 into the mid-20s, as late as 25 or even 26. And that just has to do with the developmental changes in the brain that are happening and also then the social roles that they have. So by 25, you're really expected to be on to a different stage.
What are some of the specific challenges facing this group, and how is it different, let's say, for an 11-year-old than a 19-year-old?
Well, there's two big changes that happen in the brain during adolescence, and they begin around puberty, which is actually around 10 or 11, the beginning of it. It's a little earlier for girls than for boys. But the two changes are these. The first is that we know now, and we only figured this out maybe 10 to 15 years ago, there is a second spurt of growth of new neurons and new connections in the brain that really is second only developmentally to the same kind of spurt that happens when children are very young in the first few years of life. And for a long time, we thought that was the only time this happens. So there's a growth in new neurons, new connections, and then there's a pruning back after the brain sort of works out which connections are useful and which don't get used. And that's a good thing. The pruning in the end makes the brain more efficient, but it tells us that the brain is sort of undergoing a whole lot of change. And we know now that there's sort of 1-2 punch of development is happening in the brain during adolescence. The second big change that happens during adolescence is that there's a little bit of an imbalance in the rate at which parts of the brain mature. So in a simplistic way of thinking of it, there's the kind of emotional parts of the brain that are part of the limbic system, and there's a growth spurt. You could say it sort of leaps forward. and then the other parts of the brain that are in the prefrontal cortex, so kind of at the top behind your forehead, that is where our executive function, our reasoning and judgment and ability to control our impulses, all of that is there. And it's growing and maturing, but it's more of a kind of steady process marching toward adulthood. And so what's happening is that the limbic system is outpacing the executive function in the brain in adolescence. So neuroscientists call that the imbalance model. It means there's a little bit of a gap, right, where emotion is outrunning judgment. And that explains some of the things that teenagers like to do, that they like to take risks. They are very, very, very sensitive to social cues. It explains a lot of adolescent behavior.
So when we're talking about that, we're talking about things like impulse control, like taking dares or doing things that your body physically may not be able to handle, but your brain is telling you go ahead and do?
Yeah, or things that just maybe aren't the smartest. Nobody's body could handle, like, driving too fast. I mean, for instance, just as an example, adults are more likely to drive more safely if there are other people in the car. Adolescents are more likely to drive with less care and attention to safety when there are other people in the car. And that's been proven in labs where you bring people in with their friends and put the friends in the room or even put the friends in that next room, but they can observe. And the teenagers, they get reckless in a way that adults don't. And that is one of the reasons why car accidents are a major risk during the adolescent years. And it's one reason why in some states, maybe in every state, I'm not actually sure, teenagers are not allowed to drive with other teenagers in the car early on in the period, the first getting their license. So that kind of thing.
I think that is actually the law in most states, at least most of the states that I've lived in. And now that you've explained the rationale behind it, it makes a whole lot more sense.
It really does. Yes, I happen to have teenagers in my family, and I'm very glad that these are the rules.
So, in your latest deep dive for Scientific American, you looked at how educators might take advantage of what scientists are learning about students' hypersocial brains. What did you find out?
Well, here's what's really interesting is that for a long time, we have thought of these changes or the behavior that is so common in adolescence as a problem. We're very focused on the negative and all the risks that they're taking and the seemingly stupid things that adults think they do and all of that. What the scientists are saying now is that if we pay attention to what's really going on, there's as much opportunity there as there is risk. But we need to be sensitive to how to take advantage of it. So we could capitalize, if we do that, we could capitalize on the changes in the brain and offer positive opportunities to teenagers that sort of strengthen their learning. And at the same time, we should be working especially hard to sort of stave off negative experiences like exposure to substances like drugs and alcohol early. I mean, it's really true that the earlier kids start drinking or smoking or using drugs, the worse it is for their brains. You want to give their brains as much time as possible to develop and mature before you introduce something else.
You describe this as a sea change on the horizon in developmental science, which could lead to, quote, wiser, more effective approaches to supporting young people's education and physical and mental health. So, what is the difference in these new methods and these approaches? Is it really just taking that positive spin, or is it revamping everything from the way we talk to kids to what we expect them to be able to do at certain ages?
Well, it's both. It's looking for opportunity, but the way you take advantage of that opportunity is that you really have to understand what's going to appeal to adolescents, and by contrast, what they are going to find absolutely uninteresting or boring. And so, for instance, one of the things is that adolescents are especially sensitive to status and the need to feel respected. And the further they are in their sort of maturation, the more that is true. So testosterone is a hormone, of course, that, we think of it as the male sex hormone, but it's actually present in both men and women. And measuring testosterone levels can tell you something about where someone is in once they've gone through puberty, how mature they are now. And what scientists find is that the higher testosterone levels are, the more these kinds of questions about status and respect matter and affect how the adolescents behave. And so, for instance, one of the examples I use in the story is a lot of the kinds of interventions we do with kids in school. So let's say we want to get them to eat healthier food, or we want to get them to stay away from drugs. When they're young, we often just give them information. We tell them what kind of food is healthy and what kind of food is unhealthy and things like that. But what researchers, and this research was done by David Yeager and Christopher Bryan, who are both now at the University of Texas, and their colleagues. And what they did was they looked at eighth graders, hundreds of eighth graders in Texas, and they said, well, what if we changed how we talk to them about food? In this case, they wanted to get them to eat healthier food, get them to make healthier purchases in the cafeteria for snacks. And so instead of giving the information about what's healthy and what's not, which wasn't working, they showed this same set of kids information about how food companies work. And they took reporting that was out in the world about the kinds of ingredients that food companies use, the ways that they target their marketing at, say, 13-year-old kids, and even the fact that some of these executives at these companies won't let their own children eat the food that they're producing. And the kids were outraged. They did not want to feel manipulated and taken advantage of. And in the subsequent months, the kids who had been through this process, this intervention, and learned these things, made healthier choices in the cafeteria. And the kids who were the furthest, whose testosterone levels were highest, we're the most likely to respond positively in the direction that we would want from this. So that is an example of how thinking about the need in the brain for status and respect is so critical. And I just want to point out that the puzzle before, I should have said this at the beginning, the puzzle was that what seemed to work through elementary school just kind of stopped working. And the inflection point was right around 8th grade. And now we think this is part of why, because you have to change how you talk about it to kids. You have to change the conversation.
It's fascinating because when I would talk to school counselors and often school safety officers about kids who were facing a lot of challenges or trouble, and they would always say to me, 8th grade is where the rubber meets the road.
Yes.
There's something that happens in that year where kids decide, okay, I'm heading to high school. I'm going to kind of buckle down. I'm going to focus on my academics, or they're just going to decide this is not for me and I'm going to push back with everything that I've got. That 8th grade year seems to be just so critical.
Yeah, teachers sometimes talk about the 5th grade slump and the 8th grade cliff. And so the idea is that if you look back, you could see some of those kids who in 8th grade, where, as you say, the rubber hits the road, there were probably signs when they were a little bit younger. They start to do less work or to feel more frustrated in school and maybe think this isn't for them. And that builds over those middle school years. And then by 8th grade, yeah, boom. That's when there can be dramatic changes. And so one of the ideas with this developmental approach to adolescence is to try to possibly preempt that cliff there in 8th grade by starting to change the way we talk to kids a little earlier, or take advantage before they go through puberty, sort of, when you might be able to reach them in a different way. But a lot of the problems that we see with adolescents come a little later when they're more like 16 or older. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to help them then, but there's a thought. And this is all still very new science, and it's unclear how much more effective it's going to be to reach a kid at 10 rather than 14 or 18. But it's intriguing and it's logical that it might make a difference. And what is clear is that however old they are, you need to talk to them where they are in a way that they can hear you.
We're talking with science journalist Lydia Denworth about adolescent development and the evolving research around what makes young people tick. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Wanted to mention that Lydia's latest story in the May issue of Scientific American was supported in part by an EWA Reporting Fellowship. Lydia, we've talked a little bit about what educators and researchers may be doing with this new evolving information about how adolescents develop, but what do reporters do with the information?
Well, I think it's critical for reporters as well. It's good to be up on where the science is. And I do find that there's often a lag in schools and in the wider world in terms of our understanding of things. So certainly understanding that what this means in schools is it means that social and emotional learning curriculums are really important. So reporters might need to say, hey, let me start asking around the schools in my community what they're doing on this front about social and emotional learning and issues. The other thing is that some of this research suggests that adolescents have a real need to contribute in the world in a more substantial way than I think we often give them credit for. And so that to me means that maybe there's interesting work to do looking at how schools are including community service in their curriculums. And I know that some schools are really thinking harder about how to make that a much more sort of important and kind of fundamental experience rather than just, a couple hours that kids have to tick off in order to graduate, trying to embed it in the curriculum and finding ways for what the kids do in that work to be something that they really want to do. They need to have some say in it. That's where part of this sense of respecting their opinions would come in. And it also seems to be really important. The concept of purpose is something that gets a lot of conversation in the psychology world these days. Turns out So kids do better when they have a sense of purpose. So there was a study of kids in a 4-H program in New York that was affiliated with Cornell. And when they had the kids write down beforehand what their purpose was in life or in this program, those kids turned out to be more engaged in what they then did. And so looking for schools and youth services that embed these things, I think would be really interesting and is really sort of where the cutting edge is. But what the journalists need to know is that you can't just take the school's word for it that their social and emotional work is up to snuff and that it's sort of caught up with the latest science. It would be good to double check, look for schools with best practices around the country and then find out what's happening in your community.
Well, a question that I now have that I would want an answer to is I would ask the district to tell me and show me how are those social emotional learning messaging and programs and initiatives differing from elementary to middle to high school? What are the meaningful differences there by age group based on what the best practices and best science is?
That's a very good question. And the other thing I'd say is that one of the things that this research makes clear is that the relationship between teachers and students is especially important. The way teachers speak to students is important. And of course, that's always been the case. We've known that. But now we understand that there's fine tuning to be done there. And so looking at how teachers are thinking about this at different ages and whether they are aware that, as you've just said, what they do needs to change, according to the age of the kids, would be really interesting.
Education journalist Emily Hanford, who has reported extensively on the science of reading, has made a pretty strong case that there's a disconnect between the neuroscience research that's happening and what teachers are being taught are best practices in the College of Education. Is there a similar disconnect here on adolescent development?
I can't say that I really know because, of course, I am primarily a science journalist. I write a lot about education because I write about development, but I'm less aware of how that plays out. But I can say that in general, there's just always a lag. And that one of the things that I think teachers need to do for themselves, but also journalists, is to make the effort to stay up on the science. I know that can be hard, but, look for review articles that sort of sum things up. And Google Scholar is terrific, easy place to search. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine had a big report in 2019 called The Promise of Adolescence. I think that's what it's called. And that's a great place for people to start to get some of this latest science and how. And what I liked about that report is that it really takes these ideas and it applies them to different things like education, but also criminal justice and healthcare and various things so that whatever it is you're covering, I mean, I know that we're talking here about education reporters, but these things tend to overlap in a lot of ways.
As you mentioned, you are a science writer. You do write a fair amount about adolescents and, in that regard, students in schools. And you have a book that's called Friendship, in which you wrote about how friends are critical to adolescents' well-being and to their brain development. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so these changes in the brain in adolescence, I said at the beginning that there's a lot that's relatively new in terms of what we understand about that. And it has changed how we think about what friends mean to teenagers. And, I think adults are a little bit guilty of sort of downplaying, the importance of friends. When kids talk all the time about, they seem a little obsessed, right, with their friends. Friends, 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 friends. That's all they want to do. They want to be with their friends, and parents feel sort of hurt. They feel rejected. But that is exactly what their brains are telling them to do. And so it means that in the classroom, kids who want to be in groups with their friends, in my own experience, I feel that teachers often see that as a negative because those groups of friends, then they feel that they tend to misbehave or, they're talking too much and things like that. And that may well be true. I'm not giving the kids a pass here, but I think that what the science tells us about how fundamental the importance of friendship is and learning how to be a good friend, like how important that is for young people, for the whole trajectory of their lives. Teachers can take advantage of that. They can look for ways to put kids with their friends and get better work out of them. Because actually, the research shows that kids do have sort of deeper cognitive conversations when they're with their friends than when they are not. And so, there's just this understanding that this is exactly where kids are supposed to be, that they're responding to social cues in this heightened way in adolescence, and that fighting against that is just counterproductive.
There's a lot of discussion right now on whether students have experienced learning loss as a result of the pandemic, but we also know a lot of them have lost face-to-face interaction with their peers for a year or more. Is it too early to talk about what the impact of that might be on kids' development?
It may be years before we really understand what the full impact is, but I don't think it's too early to say that we need to have deep, deep compassion for what kids have been going through during the pandemic. I mean, we need to have that for everyone, but adolescents it's especially difficult because young children have lost a lot, but what they mostly need is to feel safe, and the adults in their world make them feel safe. But what the science around the biology and evolution of friendship tells us is that kids in adolescence mostly need their friends. That's where they're focused, and so it's what they've been missing. Now, of course, a lot of them got some satisfaction from digital technology and social media and things like that. And always personality plays a part. But so we know that levels of mental health issues are higher. They were always high in adolescence, but they're much, much higher during the pandemic and in alarming ways. And that eating disorders are up. The theory is that that might be one thing that kids felt they could control. Depression and anxiety are up. And so these are serious issues. Will they stay a problem? For some kids, they will. For a lot of kids, they won't, actually. So the science of resilience and how we recover from trauma tells us that about 2/3 of people do tend to bounce back from whatever it is that they get presented with. And then the remaining group, some have sort of some psychological struggles early on, and then they recover, and then the others, it lasts a lot longer. I mean, the good news is kids are resilient. People are resilient. The bad news is that the pandemic, it's unlike anything practically that we've experienced before because it's been so long and sustained. It's more like chronic stress for a lot of people than it's been one trauma that then, you're dealing with the aftermath of. And so we don't really know, but we know enough to worry, I guess is my answer.
And I think also what's interesting and sad about this is it's the whole family unit has experienced stress. It's not one individual within it. And it's just come down like a hammer on the entire family unit.
It has. And I said that the youngest children, what matters for them most is the safety that they feel from the adults in their world. But it's also true that adolescents are feeling that as well. And if the adults in their world are coping and modeling that, resilience, then it is a lot easier for the kids to do that. But that's been a lot to cope with for the adults as well. There was a really interesting story. It's actually a friend of mine, Andrea Peterson, wrote for the Wall Street Journal about kids in the pandemic. And there was fascinating stories that she had. But one girl, she was, I think, 13 in Miami, and her grandfather had died. Her mother had to go. Everybody was grief-stricken, and schools, opened and closed, and her friendships got all sort of messed up by the drama. And it was clear that the adults in her world were really struggling as much as the kids. And that's just hard for everyone.
As a science writer, I'm sure you read a lot of the education stories that venture into your territory. And I'm wondering, is there a mistake that you often see in coverage of these kinds of issues, or maybe a misapprehension you'd want journalists to correct?
Well, I would still say that if anybody is out there really fixated on all that's wrong with adolescence, then they're missing the boat. They're behind the times. What's the cliche I want to use? And I hope that most people have learned that that's not necessarily the whole story, but I'm not so sure that that's true, especially because how teenagers behave looks so different for adults, right? That we sometimes fail to see beyond our own biases. And I can say, for instance, that like video games are a really good example. So in my research on friendship, I learned that for most kids, video games are a very, very social activity. So 3/4 of kids play video games with someone else. And that can be over the internet, or it can be like on their phone next to them while they're playing, or in the room pre-pandemic. But that is something that I think most adults look at the video game and they just see, maybe they see the violent video game, or they see, something that feels like the kids could be doing something better with their time, right? That's the focus. And I have a story in my book about finding my own kid, sitting on the couch with his best friend. And I went away for a week of reporting. I came back and it seemed like they had never moved. They were still sitting on the couch playing this video game. But the thing was that then, as it happened, I had been off reporting at an island in Puerto Rico that's a monkey colony where they're studying friendship because they're looking at the social behavior among these animals. And I am not equating my son and his friend to monkeys, but the similarities were hard to miss. They were sitting close together in close proximity the way the monkeys do, and they were bantering back and forth. They were communicating, which is kind of like, and laughing, which is like the human equivalent of grooming. And I went into the room to sort of chide them and say, why are you spending so much time on video games? Shouldn't you be doing something else? And I stopped literally mid-sentence and I said, oh, look at that, Lydia. They look an awful lot like those monkeys. And there's a social thing happening here that you're not seeing. And so I'm not trying to say that the video games are all good, but they're not as bad for kids as people tend to believe. And there's something social happening there that we're missing. So that would be my kind of analogy for how you should think about teenagers in general. What might you be missing about what they're doing?
For education reporters who are going to wade into these waters, what are some good resources for them or organizations they could trust?
Well, to get the lowdown on the science, I recommend both the Science for the Developing Adolescent at Berkeley, and they have a scientific council. So if you just look at their website, you find a long list of researchers who are doing exactly this kind of work. And if you happen to cover younger children, there's a similar group at Harvard called the Center on the Developing Child, I believe it is. One is for, one is on. I'm not sure. And Jack Shonkoff runs that, and they have been around for a long time, but they really do excellent work. And they too have a scientific council. So it's easy to find a list of social scientists out there doing exactly this kind of work and thinking developmentally about what kids need most.
Lydia Denworth is a contributing editor at Scientific American. She is also an EWA Reporting Fellow. She joined us from her home in Brooklyn, New York. Lydia, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily. It was great to be here.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.